to see you all here. Personally, I feel quite excited about the whole prospect of looking at the Reformation over the next 6 months. By the time June comes, I don't expect you'll all be here, but I hope some of you will be once we get to June. I'd like to explain to you how we came to be doing this particular topic, because we in St. Bride's, we have a course like this every year. I had set my mind on doing a course on the social preaching of the church, starting with Leo XIII and all the social encyclicals through the 20th century. And I bought a number of books on the subject, and I was not getting out of bed. I couldn't see exactly how to do it, partly because it involved me giving all the talks myself. And then one day I was having coffee with Alan Faulkner. Some of you will know Alan Faulkner. He's Church of Scotland minister, retired, who lives in Drossen. He's an academic and very much involved with ecumenism over the years. He's supposed to be involved in our final meeting, but he can't do that because he's going to Geneva for 3 months to do a, what do you call it in the Church of Scotland? We call it supply, we call it, there's another name for it. What's it called? Doesn't matter. Anyway, he's covering for somebody in Geneva. And just talking to him about other things entirely, it became crystal clear to me that what we could do was the Reformation, and within about 2 or 3 days it was all arranged. So I had a sense of the providence of God about it. My hope is that what we will be able to do, because we're from different traditions and some from no tradition at all, just with an interest, I'm hoping that we can look at what happened in Europe and in Scotland in the 16th century, and that we can come to a deeper understanding of the roots of it and the forces that were at work in the Reformation, which was they were far-reaching. Dramatic changes were taking place in the world as a result of all kinds of things, not least of which was printing and all that kind of stuff. So it was a time of important change. And our perception of it is bedevilled sometimes by religious prejudice. We're either for one side or the other, and I hope we can leave all that behind and just try to understand the whole process in itself, and come, by understanding it, come to understand ourselves better. When I was in Spain last week for a little break, I read 3 different books on the Reformation, and one of the things that struck me most forcibly was that, as in all history, nothing ever changes. The same issues keep coming up over and over again. And I hope that this course over 6 months will help us come to a deeper appreciation and understanding of, as I say, all the forces at work. So that's my hope. The next time we meet, we'll be talking about Martin Luther. Obviously, he was a key figure, and we celebrate next year the 500th anniversary of his nailing of his thesis on the door of Wittenberg University. And the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church are celebrating that together. In 1999, the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church came to a common agreement and produced a document acknowledging that really the disputes of the 16th century are no longer real. They do not exist any longer. And then we'll look at John Calvin, and we're getting closer to the Scottish Reformation at that point. And then the meeting after that, we'll look at the Scottish Reformation, which was a bit different from the rest of Europe and came a lot later. And it didn't happen for 40, 50 years after Luther. And Calvin was just a boy when Luther was doing what he was doing. In the 5th meeting, which is the one I have to give myself, we'll look at the Council of Trent, which was the Catholic Church's response to the Reformation, sometimes called the Counter-Reformation, although one of the things that we look at is whether that was an accurate description. Philip without supposing, to be honest, I don't think it was either. It's sometimes known as that. And then in the final meeting, we'll look at ecumenism in Scotland today, how far we've come the things that are going on among the churches, because at the realm of church leadership, all that prejudice and bigotry and self-outrages and all that garbage that we've put back through history, it no longer exists. And my hope was that Father Roland McFadden and Alan Faulkner could work together in this area, would do something together. But as I said, Alan's not going to be here, so we'll try and get another person from the Reformed tradition to be part of that meeting. So I hadn't intended to say all that, but it's to try and give you the context of it all. I'm now going to hand over to Philip. I'm counting on Philip to get us off to a good start, so that some of you please come back the next time. So I've known Philip for over 40 years. When I was a young priest in Kilmarnock and a school chaplain, Philip was a young teacher. Philip's a history teacher. He taught there, and then for years he taught in Queen Margaret Academy in Ayr, where he became a deputy head. He gave that up and became, many years ago, Philip was ordained? 7 years ago, Philip was ordained a priest. When he told his sister in Canada that he was doing this, she said, "What kept you?" She'd been waiting for years for it to happen. So I'll hand over to Philip now. Philip, it says the medieval church. The Philip, really that's far too much. Here for 10 years talking about the medieval church. Philip will, as I'm sure he'll explain himself, he'll kind of lay the foundation, show us what was going on prior to the Reformation, so that we have some idea of where the Reformation came from. So is that clear? You're reasonably happy with that as a plan? Good. Right, Philip, it's up to you.
Good evening. Joe has already given away part of the story, but I'm going to put the credentials on the table anyway, that I come to you this evening as an old history teacher in both senses. As Joe says, I was for 30 years a history teacher before becoming a priest, and I've got to tell you, in preparing this talk for tonight, I began to realise my age. First of all, let me tell you what you're not getting. You're not getting any deep insights based on original research, because that was never where I operated. I operated at the level of, if you like, the big picture, of trying to give young people some sense of the big picture of what was going on in the particular period of history that they were studying, some sense of what was happening, some capacity just to realise what people were going through who were caught up in those events. And I'll tell you right now, I never ever felt that I was particularly successful with the Reformation. Indeed, most history teachers would have told you the Reformation was a bad bet as a higher history question, because it was simply too big, it was too complex, and in many ways it was too far removed from the experience of the children for them ever really to come to grips with it. And there's some truth in that. I did notice, and Joe has alluded to the fact that tonight's meeting is billed as the medieval church. And I will, from time to time, mention the medieval church. But we really are talking about a major phenomenon in European history, which has been interpreted and reinterpreted since the 16th century. Even the title, the Reformation, is value loaded, and it comes to us courtesy largely of a group of 18th century German Lutheran historians. And I've often thought maybe if the Catholics had had more prominent historians, we might have been undertaking a series of talks on the defection. But that's a different matter. When I studied history at Edinburgh University in the early 70s, Marxist historians were very much in the vogue. And there was indeed a Marxist interpretation of the Reformation. as there was a Marxist interpretation of most things. Essentially, that the Reformation was a socio-economic phenomenon where the forces of an emergent capitalism in Northern Europe confronted and overcame a still semi-feudal structure. Now, the great thing about that interpretation is you could talk and argue forever and never really have to mention religion. I think I mentioned religion once, but I got away with it. The point is that with all these things, there's a lot of truth in the argument, but it can be carried to extremes. In a comparatively recent textbook written for A-level students studying Luther and the German Reformation, I came across this quotation which may reassure you. In writing this volume, the argument that to the people of the time, the events of the German Reformation were essentially about religious issues has been accepted as the most convincing currently on offer. So that's one starting point, and it's not one with which I would disagree, although it may not be the whole story. I've chosen a related starting point, but I chose it because I think the point established is so striking that it really does demand some sort of an explanation. So Joe, if you could, I don't know, let's start if I just shove it in. I need to just see this wee bit. I'd like you just to look at this, it's just a few minutes. Yeah. That's us, if you just leave it there for you, that's right. There's two portraits, and I want you to look very closely at them.
It looks solid enough, doesn't it? In the late Middle Ages, the civilization of Northern Europe seemed designed to last forever. Rich merchants, self-satisfied guilds, a conveniently loose political organization, no material reasons for change. And yet, in a few years, in a single generation, came the first of those explosions that were to create contemporary man, what we call the Reformation. What went wrong with that solid-looking world? I can't see the answer outside the fortress of Wolfsburg, but inside it, in this room, one gets a hint of trouble. It contains carvings by a sculptor named Tilman Riemenschneider, perhaps the best of the many skillful craftsmen in late 15th century Germany. And these carvings are not only moving as works of art, they show very clearly the character of North European man about the year 1500. They show to begin with his serious personal piety, a quality quite different from the bland, conventional piety that one finds in the great Italian art. And then a serious approach to life itself. These men were not to be fobbed off by forms and ceremonies. They believed there was such a thing as truth, and they wanted to get at it. What they heard from papal legates with a lot of traveling in Germany at this time didn't convince them that there was the same desire for truth in Rome. And they had a rough, raw-boned peasant tenacity of purpose. So far, so good. But these places reveal a more dangerous characteristic, a very hysterical. The 15th century had been the century of revivalism, religious movements on the fringe of the Catholic Church. Even in Italy, Savonarola persuaded his hearers to make a bonfire of their so-called vanities, including pictures by Botticelli, which I suppose was a bad day of civilization. The Germans were much more easily excited. Look at this Italian carving of Raphael. He's not only a man of high culture, but completely self-contained, and compare him with one of the greatest of German portraits, Dürer's Oswald Krell. Those staring eyes, that look of self-conscious introspection, that uneasiness, marvelously conveyed by Dürer through the uneasiness of the plains and the mountain, how of Germany it is, and what a nuisance for the rest of the world.
I just wanted you to see the two portraits. And there's obviously a big question arises, which I think goes to the heart of the Reformation. Why is that Italian cardinal, in the words of Sir Kenneth Clarke, a man so balanced and self-contained, when Oswald Krell is hovering on the verge of hysteria? And yet both of them are men of the age of Reformation. I'd suggest that there are three major themes that we need to consider which go to the heart of the matter. The first is what I would term a factor of tightening. The second is a factor of slackening. And the third is simply a big idea. I think the difference between the two men is that Oswald Krell, the second portrait we looked at, is a man who's feeling the full force both of this tightening and slackening process, while the cardinal is privy to the big idea. So just let me show you my working before I begin. What follows is really just a short précis of the views of three major historians, Professor Joel Husfield, Professor Dennis A. and Sir Kenneth Clarke, that we've already heard from. Now I've chosen to give the term tightening to the historical phenomena of the age of Reformation described and analysed by Professor Husfield, and I want to begin with a quotation from him. The Reformation was, in the profoundest sense, a crisis of authority, which, in the circumstances of the time, expressed itself with the peculiar fervour of entrenched religious dogma. The result is that some of the fundamental issues which confronted Europe were driven into the narrow technical channels of theology and were therefore obscured and distorted almost beyond recognition. And it's really this final sentence. Men argued with the greatest intensity because they were insecure and frightened, and in any case uncertain as to what the argument was about. Now, at a later stage in the same article, he uses the term sense of instability. And that sense of instability goes close to the heart of the Reformation crisis. So why were things unstable? And how could this possibly be construed in terms of tightening rather than slackening? Well, I suppose at the time, or at the simplest level, in times of instability, people do look for something certain to hold on to, but there's a lot more to it than just that, even if that desire for something certain is at the heart of the Reformation. The first contention is this, that the major guarantors of international, or indeed universal authority were on the wane. Of these guarantors, there were two, the Empire and the Papacy. Now, although in theory the two offices were mutually supportive, the Empire being the defender of the Papacy in the secular world, even at their high point in the Middle Ages, the two had never sat well together. Nevertheless, at that time, in the High Middle Ages, there had been both vision and substance in both offices. What Hurstfield is suggesting is that by the time of the Reformation, you had a poisonous combination of vision and lack of power in one institution, and the remnants of power and the lack of vision in the other. To be precise, the empire, which had become the personal fiefdom of the House of Habsburg, was a great, unwieldy conglomeration of states which ambitious emperors were trying, with varying degrees of lack of success, to transform into some kind of reality of power and status. They certainly had a vision, just maybe not the power to realise it. While the papacy still had the remnants of effective power and the capacity to enforce its will, but there was no great vision that it was seeking to enforce. Instead, popes had really become quite small-scale French or Italian politicians. So, I suppose what Hurstfield is getting at is there's no great sense of authority in Europe. Well, certainly no great sense of universal authority, but what about a consequent sense of local authority? And the answer to that is yes. Not yes, but yes. Because I think we're working our way towards it. Now, I don't want to spend too long on this aspect of the crisis, because essentially it would just get us all bogged down in a quagmire of complexity. But to try to put it at its simplest, and even at its simplest, it's complex. There were a number of conflicting sources of local authority really trying to assert themselves against this background of the weakness of the papacy and the empire, but equally against a background of profound economic uncertainty and change. That the economic uncertainty was of long duration, going back to the agricultural crisis following the Black Death, when a lack of people to work the land had really forced landowners to abandon the feudal economy based on service to a cash economy based on rent. The problem was that with the coming of the 16th century, there was price instability, rents dropped in value, and landowners wanted their lands back at a time when increasing population meant land hunger. Things in the countryside were unstable and getting worse, and they weren't much better in the towns where there was great commercial uncertainty. The political system, if you want to give it that grandiose term, was one of what you might call emerging stability, but it still had a long way to emerge. The net gainers in the long term would be the nation states, who would eventually wrest control of their own affairs from Pope and Emperor and town and local estates and parliaments. But that would be a long time coming. And in the early 16th century, we are at the early stages of that process. Really a stage when old authority has not fully collapsed and new authority had not yet emerged. And all this against a background of great social and economic uncertainty. So, does this not sound like slackening rather than tightening? I would say ask Oswald Crell. If you imagine yourself in this situation, nothing is certain. Not economics, not politics, not life itself. You know, that factor of tightening surely lies in a feeling of enormous pressure, a pressure of uncertainty. Where then do you look for the antidote? well. What can I hold on to, like grim death, that will give me some security, something to slacken this pressure? We're going to switch now to Professor Dennis Hay for some slackening. Unfortunately, it's entirely the wrong kind of slackening for 16th century men and women. What Professor Hay highlights for us is what I might term an institutional diminution in the church. At a time when people like Oswald Crell are desperately searching for truth, they're searching for certainty, they're searching for something to hold on to in time of crisis, and they're not getting it. Now, I want to stress once again that I think what Hay is talking about is an institutional diminution, and I'm using the word diminution carefully. I don't mean, and he doesn't mean, decline per se, but precisely diminution, and getting smaller of things. If you like, a strengthening of forces of reductionism, a strengthening of forces of smallness, a strengthening of forces of introspection. And I think that's really important, because the institutional reality of the church, that which people experience in their dealings with the church, was reinforcing rather than counteracting a prevailing religious mood of pious, individualistic devotionalism, really aimed at securing personal salvation. And I would suggest that that was very much Martin Luther's mindset in his early days. So people are not being nourished. They are, if anything, simply being reinforced in this religious, spiritual smallness, if you want to put it that way. Now, the consequences of that institutional diminution were also felt at the level of the crisis adverted to by Professor Hurstfield of the universal institutions giving way to national ones. Professor Hay's starting point is the great schism of the church, which began in the 14th century and continued into the 15th. Now, those of us who attended the course on the history of the popes here at St. Bride's will be aware of these events, but in essence, Pope Urban VI, an Italian, was resident in Rome, and his rival, elected by the French cardinals, a Frenchman, Clement VII, was resident in Avignon. Now, both the crisis and the resolution of it had significant long-term consequences, and Professor Hay highlights four. That it had the effect of reinforcing and firmly establishing a tendency to place the boundaries of church government along national lines, really along the boundary lines of secular states, which was not the case in the High Middle Ages. And he gives the example that the great international religious orders, like the Cistercians and the Cluniacs, they no longer transcended national boundaries. They really gave their allegiance to the rulers of the territories, or maybe more correctly, the chosen pope of the rulers of the territories, within whose boundaries their houses lay. Secondly, the existence of more than one pope had played into the hands of the princes, who could in effect decide which pope they would obey. Lorenzo de' Medici in 1477 bemoaned the fact that they were back to one pope, when he wrote to a friend, 3 or 4 popes would be better than a single one. Certainly better for him as a prince. suppose the third thing that he identifies is this: there was simply a kind of widespread embarrassment to the office of the Pope by the inability to resolve this crisis. We did have 3 at one point. And also in resolving the crisis at the Council of Constance, representatives of the nations, again these nation states, were consulted. And the fourth one, and an important one, is this: that the doctrine of conciliarism developed at this time, and it was embodied in a decree of the Council of Constance that a general council of the Church was, in the last resort, superior to the Pope. There was, if you like, a court of appeal against decisions of the Pope. So, there's a kind of smallness here. There's a kind of drawing back from the sort of great international authority of the Middle Ages towards something smaller and more local. And it exists at another level as well. Although he offers no causal relationship between the institutional diminution of the Church and other religious phenomena of the age of Reformation, he does make this observation, and it's a telling one. In the later Middle Ages, in this period running up to the outbreak of the Reformation, both heresy and reform existed only at a regional level and were effective only insofar as they enjoyed lay support. Heresy is small scale, and so is religious reform. And he contrasts Catharism of the 12th century, which affected huge areas of the Mediterranean world, won many converts, had to be countered by a crusade. He compares that with Lollardy in England and Hussitism in Bohemia, where there was no great spread, there wasn't any real attempt to convert other countries. And as for religious reform, it too was splintered, it was sporadic, it was pietistic, it was mystical, it was largely lay in nature. And as the professor observes, no Bernard or Francis fired the imagination of all men in the 14th and 15th centuries. And equally, there was no Innocent III to oversee the diffusion of the Franciscans and the Dominicans all over Christendom. The bottom line is this: there was some life in the old dog yet, but it was small scale, it was localized, and it was limited. Yet, lay piety was strong, and lay people were increasingly well educated, and with the coming of the printing press, increasingly well provided with texts of a religious nature. But is there a sense that with this institutional diminution of the Church, they may increasingly have felt left to their own devices? Certainly, there are indications that if they were looking for a strong lead from the clergy, that they might wait a long time. But even here, I think we need to be cautious in our approach, lest we simply caricature the reality of the age. There was anti-clericalism, but in the words of Dr. McCoy, it's anti-clericalism, Jim, but not as we know it. Facing up to the reality of 15th and 16th century anti-clericalism, I'm reminded of the story of a parish priest who once lambasted his parishioners from the pulpit with the complaint, "You Lord don't even have the guts to commit a decent mortal sin." So with many of the pre-Reformation clergy, not big sinners, but not quite up to scratch, and not inspirational. But in a sacramental church, there isn't an alternative. And I've actually put a wee note here, an aside on the miracle of Sombrero. So let's have an aside on it. Sombrero is a village in Galicia, and there is quite a famous Eucharistic miracle associated with the village. The chalice of the miracle is still there. And the story is this, that a shepherd fought his way through a blinding blizzard. It was very high. Fought his way through a blinding blizzard to get to Mass and arrived just at the time of the consecration. The priest who was there in his own looked up, saw this guy coming in. I don't even think he thought to himself or said to himself, I think he probably said to this guy, what kind of nutter are you, struggling your way through a snowstorm to get here for this? I'm doing this day in, day out anyway, I'm not sure that I really believe in it. That's the general gist of the miracle. That the layman, the good shepherd, well, good in that sense, is a half-decent shepherd, struggles through the blizzard to get there for Mass, arrive at the consecration, only to be confronted by a priest who doesn't really believe what he's doing and has absolutely no care for this man. And of course the story of the miracle is that the actual blood of Christ wells up out of the chalice and overflows. And of course I'm not using this in a theological term, the shepherd is justified in what he has done. And it's a very interesting story. But what happens the next time the shepherd comes to Mass? It's the same priest that's going to be there. It just occurred to me, that maybe if you've got slackening in the priesthood, slackening in the religious life, there isn't an alternative. It's the same folk that come and take time after time after time after time. And he has a very interesting insight in this. This is what he says. The priest at the altar and his role in the ordered services of the church were not questioned. It was only in the marketplace that the uniform of the clergy provoked derision. What was it that annoyed people? Well, simply this: the clergy don't inspire. There's slackness, but they still ask for money, for tithes, for stole fees. And as he says, it's not big sums, but it's kind of constant. Then there was also the fact that they had benefit of clergy, that they were special. It was one rule for lay people and it was one rule for the clergy. And increasingly people were saying, why? Why is this guy different from me? And of course, benefit of clergy allowed those who were in holy orders to place themselves beyond the reach of the civil law and just appeal to the courts of canon law, to go to the church courts. And that could happen even for quite serious crimes. So, the demands are still there, but you feel the inspiration is not there. And then there's just this slackness. And I think this is part of this smallness. It's always great when you look at the Reformation, because the Reformation was such a big movement with such tremendous consequences. All the causes have to be tremendous. So, it's great. We can all look at Alexander VI, the Borgia. Look what he's up to, illegitimate children and having folk bumped off and all the rest of it. How many folk knew what the hell Alexander VI was doing? Outside a tiny wee group at the papal court in Rome, they didn't know anything about him. But they knew their parish priest. They knew the nuns doing their own. And if there's slackness there, they feel it. And I think there is I think he's got something here about this kind of smallness, this kind of diminution. And I've got a sheet here I'd like you to have a wee look at. It's what Dennis Hay, it's a visitation ordered by a bishop of what Dennis Hay describes as a not very corrupt nunnery. You know, and that's, I think he's onto something. It's not very corrupt, it's just slack. Have a wee look at this and see what you think. I don't think you're going to find, I certainly don't find that these nuns are particularly villains. They're just no up to it. Do you like to pass those out? I'll hold it away. But that's the next bit, that's the big bit. Well, maybe not all, but the first half, roughly. Just I'm aware of the thing, that's okay. Now, I don't know what you think of this, but it's no, I don't find it shocking or horrifying, but we just feel they're playing at this a wee bit. In the first place, that all nuns, those at any rate who are able, be present every night at matins in the choir. Lasses, would you like to come along and join in the communal prayer of the, of the convent from time to time? That would be nice. Also that strangers who come to the monastery be straight away brought into the abbess's hall by the gatekeeper of the monastery, and don't just kind of wander in and go about their business, whatever it is they're up to. There'd be no watchings or drinkings after compline. But, there are other things as well which you feel are no right. Also that seemly and sufficient cells be set in order in the infirmary for nuns who are in bad health. They're not being looked after either. It's just a general slackness. Also young nuns go not out of the cloister precinct to the outer court alone. No secular person, friar, or other man of religion enter the cloister precincts for the nuns' lodgings after compline, which is the last service at night, or before the bell rings for prime, which is the first service in the morning. So at night time, when the sisters are in their cells, in their senses in one, that's it. They're in their cells. You don't go in and just pay them a visit. So there's just this kind of... Well, the other bit, you can understand why they want to ban university students for anywhere near the place. I get that, but... And yet you notice his comment, yet these very men and women ask for special treatment. So there's something there, all right. So, what we're saying... I suppose we're saying this, a time when people like Oswald Crell are kind of holding on by their fingertips, they might want something a bit more substantial to hold on to than what they're being presented with. And yet, the Cardinal, whom you saw in the portrait, he seems to be holding on very well indeed. Same time, a man of the same period, a man presumably aware of the same pressures, but you see him sitting there, self-contained, confident. What's going on? Well, the Cardinal is holding on very well because he's holding on to a very big idea. Well, Crell is getting the worst of the tightening and the slackening. The Cardinal has got a big idea. The problem is he's holding on to it in more senses than one. It may be greatly reassuring to him, but he's really not telling anybody else about it. It's reassuring to him, but he's keeping it to himself. Now, what is this big idea all about? See if you could make any sense of this. I came across a reference when I was doing some reading in preparation for this talk, and it was about a scholar who fell foul of the university authorities for expressing the opinion that neither Jesus Christ, nor St. Paul, nor St. Augustine were monks. That was his revolutionary contention, that neither Jesus Christ, nor St. Paul, nor St. Augustine were monks. And the university authorities came down on him like a ton of bricks. What's all that about? These are not stupid men. So, what is this, what you might call quaint exchange all about? Well, it's all about this. It's all about the lack of a big idea, the consequences of the discovery of which are still with us. Now, this big idea was discovered, actually it was rediscovered, at the very beginning of a movement in European history known as the Renaissance. And you may imagine my surprise when, as a young undergraduate, a lecturer in my European history class, indeed, it may well have been the aforementioned Professor A, went on at great length about something I'd never even heard of, and for the life of me could not understand the significance of. And that was the rediscovery of Cicero's letters to Atticus. Now, he went on as though this was, I mean, if you probably depict the three most important events in all of European history, this would be one of them, and maybe this would be the first of them. And I thought, okay, I just couldn't see it. But actually, he was right, because it provoked an awakening of the European mind around this idea. And it's an idea which has huge consequences at the time of the Reformation and since. And here's the idea. Things weren't always the way they are now. Now, I notice that people are not overwhelmed by that idea. They're just all sitting with me. That is a bigger idea than E equals MC squared, believe you me. Things were not always the way they are now. Because the medieval mind operated on the assumption that things always had been the way they were now. So, if, and it was fairly obvious if you looked around, if learned and holy men were monks, you can follow the logic of this, if learned and holy men are monks, Jesus Christ, St. Paul and St. Augustine are holy men, therefore Jesus Christ, St. Paul and St. Augustine must be monks. That's the logic of it. But you can extend, because equally, the Romans and Greeks, all other people, even if they were pagan, nevertheless, if they attained to the highest levels of life, they must have lived like monks. Cicero's letters to Atticus revealed something quite different. The cultivated, educated man of letters who engaged with the world, who rejoiced in the world, and who did not recoil from it as a veil of tears. Now, there's an idea, there's an inspiration, and it's the inspiration of humanism, which could become Christian humanism. It's a spirit of engagement as opposed to a spirit of disengagement. And it actually leads quite neatly, once they read Cicero's letters to Atticus, you know, the penny drops. God, the Greeks and the Romans had a brilliant way of living their lives, they had a brilliant way of living in the world. Let's rediscover that secret and apply it to our own times. It's revolutionary. Now initially, it's applied simply to the world of pagan Greece and Rome, but gradually it extends to the idea, so if everything was not always the way it is now, was the church always the way it is now? Can we perhaps rediscover what the early church was like? Maybe what Scripture actually said, and apply that to our own times. That is a revolutionary idea, and it's maybe a way out of some of the bleakness and some of the deadlock that we've got. Because if it's not always like this, well, why are we putting up with this? Why don't we change it? Now, this is not leading inexorably towards the Reformation, I've got to say. I think it can go that way, but it can go another way. It can go in the direction of Christian humanism. And I suspect that's the big idea that's keeping the cardinal sitting there, smiling and content, introspective and reassured, because he's clearly a man of learning, he's clearly a man of the new learning, he's clearly a man who has said to himself, yeah, things are bad, but we can change this. The only unfortunate thing is, they don't actually really get round to changing it before the reformers take a more radical line with things. They get onto the thing first. Maybe because the urgency is a lot more pressing on them than it was in these, I think, kind of effete scholars who are a wee bit men in their ivory towers who don't really communicate to the masses, even though the masses are crying out for that communication. And it takes a Luther to break through. We'll have a wee look at this programme by Sir Kenneth Clark, where he looks at the Reformation. It's very interesting the amount of time he spends on Erasmus compared with the amount of time he spends on Luther. But he makes a very telling point about Erasmus. He said, Erasmus wrote in Latin, which meant that he could be understood everywhere, but not by everybody. And you get the impression that Sir Kenneth Clark probably thought and a good thing too. Whereas what Luther and the Reformers are really about is bringing about change for the masses. Before they go mad, before they go a bit like Oswald Crell, for goodness sake, feed the people before they starve. So we'll have a wee look at Kenneth.
It looks solid enough, doesn't it? In the late Middle Ages, the civilization of Northern Europe seemed designed to last forever. Rich merchants, self-satisfied guilds, a conveniently loose political organization, no material reasons for change. And yet, in a few years, in a single generation, came the first of those explosions that were to create contemporary man, what we call the Reformation. Something wrong with that solid-looking world. I can't see the answer outside this world, but inside it, in this room, one gets a hint of trouble. It contains carvings by a sculptor named Tilman Riemenschneider, perhaps the best of the many skillful craftsmen in late 15th century Germany. And these carvings are not only moving as works of art, they show very clearly the character of North European man about the year 1500. They show to begin with his serious personal piety, a quality quite different from the bland, conventional piety that one finds in a great deal of Italian art. And then a serious approach to life itself. These men were not to be fogged off by forms and sentiments. They believed there was such a thing as truth, and they wanted to get at it. What they heard from papal legates with a lot of traveling in Germany at this time didn't convince them that there was the same desire for truth in Rome. And they had a rough, raw-boned peasant tenacity of purpose. So far, so good. But these faces reveal a more dangerous characteristic, a very Christian. The 15th century had been the century of revivals of religious movements on the fringe of the Catholic Church. Even in Italy, Savonarola persuaded his hearers to make a bonfire of their so-called vanities, including pictures by Botticelli, which I suppose was a bad day of civilization. The Germans were much more easily excited. Look at this Italian carnival by Raphael. He's not only a man of high culture, but completely self-contained. And compare him with one of the greatest of German portraits, Dürer's Oswald Kremp. Those staring eyes, that look of self-conscious introspection, that uneasiness, marvelously conveyed by Dürer through the uneasiness of the plains and the motley part of Germany it is, and what a nuisance for the rest of the world. However, in the 1490s, these destructive national characteristics hadn't yet shown themselves. It was still an age of internationals. And in 1498 there arrived in Oxford a boy scholar who was destined to become the spokesman of northern civilization and the greatest internationalist of his day, Erasmus. Erasmus was a Dutchman who came from Rotterdam. But he never went back to live in Holland. He'd been in a monastery there, and he hated it. And he also hated the coarse, convivial life of the average Netherlander. People all complained that they drank too much. He himself had a delicate digestion and would drink only a special kind of burgundy. All his life he moved from place to place, partly to avoid the plague, because that king of terrors kept all free men on the move throughout the early 16th century, and partly due to a restlessness that overcame him if he stayed anywhere too long. However, in his earlier life, he seems to have liked England, and he had a successful stay in Magdalen College, and so this country makes a brief appearance in our earlier civilization. Considering the barbarous and the disorderly state of England in the 15th century, Oxford and Cambridge are astonishing creations. And the Oxford, the work of Erasmus, still contained a few, very many I suppose, pious and enlightened men. Of course, the atmosphere must have been somewhat provincial and unsophisticated compared to Florence, even Bologna. And yet, about the year 1500, this kind of naivete had its value, and Erasmus was it, now recognized it. He'd seen enough of the religious life to know that the church must be reformed not only in its institutions, but in its teachings. It was once the great civilizer of Europe, and now it was a ground stranded on forms and vested interests. And he knew that there was more potent reform on the teachings of a man like Collett, in St. Paul's, who simply wanted people to read the Bible as if it were true, than from the sharp wits of Florence. The intelligence and the tact by which Erasmus made himself so immediately welcomed by the finest minds in England are alive to us in his letters. And by great good fortune, we can supplement these letters by visible evidence, because he is the friend of the most incisive portrait painter of the time, Hans Holbein. Holbein's portraits show Erasmus when he had become famous and elderly, but they have so complete a grasp of his character that we can imagine him at every age. Like all humanists, I might almost say, like all civilized men, Erasmus set a high value on friendship, and he was anxious that Holbein should go to England to paint pictures of his friends. And finally, in 1526, Holbein went and was introduced into the circle of Sir Thomas More. The brilliant youth with whom 20 years earlier Erasmus had fallen in love was now Lord Chancellor. He was also the author of the Utopia, where in rather a quaint style he recommends almost everything that was believed in by enlightened reformers in the 1890s. Holbein painted a large picture of Sir Thomas More and his family. Erasmus was staying in the house at the time, and after the picture was burnt, but the original drawing remains with the name of the sitters written in. Erasmus used to say that More's family were like the Academy of Plato, where in Holbein's studies of the heads, they don't look oppressively intellectual, but alert, sensible people of any epoch. Thomas More himself, of course, was a noble idealist, too good for the world of action, where he sometimes lost his way. It shows how quickly civilizations can appear and disappear. That the author of the Utopia should have flourished, should have become, in spite of himself, the first minister of the crown, halfway between the death of Richard III and the judicial murders of Henry VIII, of which he, of course, was to be the most distinguished victim. Holbein depicted other members of Erasmus's surge in England, and I'm bound to say that some of them, like the archbishops and Ware and Fisher, look as if they had no illusions about the transitory nature of civilization at the court of Henry VIII. They were defeated, and they were defeated. In 1506, Erasmus went to Italy. He was in Bologna at the exact time of Louis II's famous quarrel with Michelangelo. He was in Rome when Raphael began work on the papal apartments. But none of this seemed to have made any impression on him. His chief interest was in printing, in the publication of his works by the famous Venetian printer and pioneer of popular editions, Aulus Manutius. When I have been talking about Italy, one's concerned with the enlargement of man's spirit through the visual image. In the North, one's chiefly concerned with the extension of his mind through the word. And this was made possible by the invention of printing. In the 19th century, people used to think of the invention of printing as the linchpin in the history of civilization. Well, 1st century Greece, 1st century Chartres, 15th century France got on very well about it. And which will say that they were less civilized than we are. Still, on balance, I suppose that printing has done more good than harm. One certainly feels that way in the beautiful humanized workshop of the Tonquin Press in Antwerp. And one can't forget with awe on this simple, simple invention. It looks so easy to work. Well, it is easy to work. Wrote it in like that. Take this arm, pull it hard as you can, very hard. Roll it back, open it up. And take out your printed sheet. How easy they are to operate. You would have thought that anyone would have thought besides the wheel. Yet it was so effective that it remained practically unchanged for about 400 years. And perhaps one's doubts about the civilizing effect of printing have been aroused by a later development of the craft. Of course, printing had been invented long before the time of Erasmus. Gutenberg's Bible was printed in 1456. But these early printed books were sumptuous and expensive, done in competition with manuscripts. men only gradually realized that printed books should reach as many people as possible. And it took preachers and persuaders almost 30 years to recognize what a formidable new instrument had come into their hands, just as it took politicians 20 years to recognize the value of television. The first man to take advantage of the printing press was Erasmus. It made him and unmade him, because in a way he became the first journalist. He had all the qualifications. A clear, elegant style, in Latin of course, which meant that he could be read everywhere, but not by everyone. Opinions on every subject. Even the gift of putting things so that they could be interpreted in different ways. Early in his journalistic career, he produced a masterpiece, The Praise of Folly. He wrote it staying with his friend Thomas More. He said it took him a week. I dare say it's true. He had an amazing fluency, and this time his whole being was engaged. We know an intelligent man, human beings and human institutions sometimes seem intolerably stupid. And there are times when one's pent-up feelings of impatience and annoyance can't be contained any longer. Erasmus's Praise of Folly was an outburst of this kind. It washed away everything. Popes, kings, monks, of course, scholars, war, theology, the whole works. This is a page from it with a marginal drawing by Holbein showing Erasmus at his desk. And over the drawing, Erasmus has written that if he was really as handsome as this, he wouldn't lack for a wife. In the ordinary way, satire is a negative activity. But there are times in the history of civilization when it has a positive value. Times when the flypaper of complacency holds down the free spirit. And this was the first time in history that a bright-minded intellectual exercise, something to make people stretch their minds and think for themselves and question everything, has been made available to thousands of readers all over Europe. It happened that during the same period in which Erasmus was spreading enlightenment through the word, another development of the art of printing was nourishing the imagination. The illustrated book, engraved on a wooden block like this. Of course, the illiterate faithful had for centuries been instructed by wall paintings and stained glass. But the vast multiplication of images was made possible by the printing woodcut, put this form of communication on quite a different footing. At once more widespread and more intimate. And as usual, the invention coincided with the man. And the man was Albrecht Dürer. He was born and brought up in Nuremberg, the town of the Meister.
You notice that Kenneth Clark is talking about the Reformation, and he's God knows how many minutes into it, and he hasn't got anywhere near Martin Luther, and Martin Luther gets about 30 seconds. The reason I stopped it was he now goes on to Albrecht Dürer, it goes on and on and on and on and on, and then you see him sitting outside the tower where, you know, Luther did many of his works. Well, there's no doubt that Luther was a hero. Yeah, he said, "Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise." Now let's move on. And the reason why I really wanted you to see Sir Kenneth Clark was Kenneth Clark is really a kind of Christian humanist. I don't know how Christian, but he was certainly a humanist. He is clearly this kind of man of letters. His admiration for Erasmus and for Sir Thomas More is fairly obvious. You know, you did hear him say, you know, oh, the printing press was absolutely wonderful. It allowed Erasmus, you know, to disseminate his work to thousands of people. You know, he wrote in Latin, of course, which meant he could be read everywhere. And then comes the crunch, but not by everybody. And that's crucial. That's the main truth. These guys have got the answer. They really do have the answer to the crisis which is giving rise to the Reformation. But they keep it to themselves. Or they keep it to their own kind of elite group. I was saying to Joe earlier on, I think the Christian humanists finally do make their mark on the church, but it's in the Second Vatican Council. It's not even in the Council of Trent, it's in the Second Vatican Council that the Christian humanist impact is really made known. And you think, why did it take all these hundreds of years to arrive at that point? They had the answer. Go back to Scripture. Let people read Scripture for themselves. Let the Word of God penetrate people. Let them live Christian lives. The Christian humanists know that, but they're not applying it. And it takes somebody like Luther to begin to disseminate it to a lower level. Now, right enough, when it descends to the level of the peasant revolt, Luther's not long in pulling back and getting the princes to get out there and smite these peasants, because we're not wanting this, not running riot, we're not wanting anarchy here, we want something controlled. But that's later. He does at least introduce some sense of hope, something for people like Oswald Cromwell, who you feel are just hanging on by their fingertips. Now, the reason why I stopped it wasn't so as I could just keep talking on. I know we have to finish by 9, but I'll just suggest this. There is a crisis, all right, in Europe. It's a great crisis of confidence, it's a great crisis of authority, because established authority just seems to be kind of not crashing, it's just kind of withering away. People are looking for some kind of certainty in their lives. It's a frantic search for certainty in their lives. It's a frantic search for reassurance that they will be saved ultimately. And they're not getting a convincing response from the church. So that when somebody like Luther comes along and speaks authoritatively, people flock to him. That's it, I'm shutting up. But if anybody would like to ask questions or make observations, the floor is yours. Yes.
Thank you very much, Philip. I'm Hugh Miller. I work in Kilmarnock in education.
Yes, indeed.
Indeed. It was a good time.
It was.
It was good people.
Yes.
So that was obvious tonight. You spoke very well. Much better than Kenneth Clark when he said. So I listened with great interest to everything you said. I'm not sure I was entirely convinced tonight. I've got a challenge for you. Take on something new. When you think about religion as an important phenomenon, I'm not a religious person. But it's certainly, historically, a very important culture-shaping phenomenon. Then you've got to ask, what is the essence of it? Is it about changing water into wine? Is it about walls and coming down around Jericho? Is it about somebody stepping in a cloud and going up to heaven? What is the essence of it? And my conclusion is that religion is about helping people to be good, to live a good life. And if you look on YouTube, you'll find a debate between Richard Dawkins on the one hand and John Haldane, the philosophy professor in St Andrews, on the other, defending John Haldane's a prominent Roman Catholic, and he's defending his point of view. And he does it not by trying to show how many people are in the Trinity, or he does it by saying, how are you going to live a good life if you don't have the support of the people around about you in some organized way? So, if that is the essence of religion, you know, the professor at Edinburgh in the 1980s, John McMurray, says religion is about living with other people. And if that's really what it's about, and we are a social species, and we grasp instinctively the idea that if we can work together, we can do a lot more than if we work in isolation individually. So if that's where religion comes from, that feeling, that human feeling, very important human feeling, if that's where religion comes from, then your organization needs good leadership, faithful to the calling of helping people to live a good life. And the worst thing that can happen, it's not an unimportant, it's the very worst thing that can happen is, people, you call it a slackness. But it's a failure of leadership. And when the folks see that, they'll turn away and they'll turn towards something else. There was a young fellow in Salto visiting my granny in Drawston on a Sunday. The swing parks were all locked up. It was a constant country. The swing parks were all locked up. You could climb over the fence to get in. The clubs all shut at 9 o'clock. You couldn't get a drink anywhere. The bookies were illegal. And you had to find them round a corner where you could put a shilling on the Grand National. And the people want moral discipline. And that's why the religious organizations are there in the first place, and they've got to be faithful. And then we had a Reformation because they let the people down for a while, and the thing had to be invented again.
I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. The only slight caveat I have in terms of the Reformation, I agree totally with your analysis. Essentially, I think Christianity is fairly straightforward. I believe that Jesus Christ is who he claims to be. He is the Son of God. He comes to deliver the ultimate revelation of God to us. And the ultimate revelation is we are to be like him. And therefore, you're absolutely right. It should manifest itself in us. If we are to become the body of Christ, that should be made manifest. That should be visible to the world. I'm not 100% certain, but I'm pretty sure that that was not a prevailing view at the time of the Reformation. That I think the prevailing view of most people at the time of the Reformation, it's certainly what haunted Martin Luther in his early days until he became liberated from this, was this intense quest for personal salvation. It was highly individualistic. It was I need, and highly individualistic, I think was pretty heretical within the Catholic Church as well. What is it that I need to do to save myself? And the answer is believe. Do you not believe that Christ died to save me? What is it that I must do to save myself? And Luther, nearly drives himself to a breakdown. I think he does drive himself to a breakdown in this quest to save himself. So I think at the time of the Reformation, there is this intensely personal focus on saving myself. I think we've come an awful long way since then, and the realisation is that I exist for others. That my salvation is in the salvation of everybody. That God's will is that everybody should be saved. That's the great message of this year above all, is the year of mercy. That God really wants the salvation of everybody. And that as the body of Christ, we work towards it. Anybody else observe or question? Yes?
Yes, unless I occasionally didn't hear things, but...
Right, I'll come on a little bit.
No, it's not your fault, but we haven't, I don't think we've heard about the leading Scottish scholar of the 16th century, John Major, Johannes Meyer, he seemed to have followed what Erasmus was doing in that, although he remained a Catholic till he died, he also advocated reforms and taught people in Sorbonne and in Scotland as diverse as John Calvin, we're going to hear about later in the series, Ignatius Loyola and John Knox. So that you could have a more diverse trio than that. Could you just say maybe a couple of words about him, since there's not so much on the internet about him?
I don't know anything about him. I declared my credentials right at the beginning. I came to give you a kind of overview, a feel for what people were experiencing at the time of the Reformation. I have no authority on these things at all.
Yes.
But I mean,
He tends to be forgotten
because of probably Erasmus, probably.
Swept away
Yeah.
by, he wasn't, put in the dustbin of history, as people sometimes say, and he was hugely influential on the future King of Britain, James VI and Ferdinand, with a very scholarly upbringing, which included reading John Major's History of Greater Britain. So even the Bible was an inspirational thing. But I hadn't heard about him at all in my youth, although I grew up in the house that he built. He was a monk. He preached against pluralities, but he was the vicar of Dundalk, he was the principal of Glasgow University, and the chaplain of the Chapel Royal in Stirling, which seemed to go slightly against some of his own teaching.
Could we pencil in another one, Joe? Very major. Not the Prime Minister.
I think he's covered
Joe.
I mean, obviously, we're having a very general look at.
Yes, absolutely.
That may come up when you.
It may. Oh, it may well. It may well.
I would ask you, Philip, could you do one thing very quickly? Could you explain the difference between humanism in the 16th century and humanism today? Because they're entirely different.
All right, they are.
People might be struggling to
Yes,
understand
yes.
those stories.
Particularly if you put if you attach Christian to it, or the wondering what humanism, as understood at the time of the Renaissance, is the study of the humanities. It's basically it starts off fundamentally as a study of all things Greek and Roman, really to try to get the measure of the Greeks and Romans, to get the success of their society. Now initially it started off just as a kind of eclectic thing, it was just kind of gathering the information, gathering the knowledge for the sake of gathering it. But it then takes on a whole different momentum when you then start to apply it to the society of your time. And of course the methodology of getting back to basics, getting back to the original sources, discovering the secret of the original sources, and then applying that to your own circumstances, is really what humanism amounts to in the 16th century. It's not a rejection of God. It's not a sole dependence on humanity. That's why it can be Christian humanism, because you can apply the same technique. You can go back to the early church fathers. You can go back to the original, the original text, the original scriptural text, and translate them for yourself. That's one of the things that Erasmus does. He translates the New Testament. So there is that distinction between the humanism of the Renaissance and the Reformation period, and humanism, which tends to be kind of antithetical to religion, which we have today. It's a different phenomenon.
But is it not the case, though, that it's really a matter of emphasis? The humanists, let's take the Greeks, the emphasis was on what human beings could do.
Oh yes, you're right.
And you get to the message, he's teaching Hamlet what is
correct. Oh no, it can go that way. It can go into an anti-religious, religious mode. Some people would argue that in actual fact, if we watch this programme through to the end, there's a very interesting point that's made by Kenneth Clark, and it is this: that as the humanists saw the way the Reformation developed, as they saw things getting out of hand, they withdrew. They actually pulled back from the world. He gives you the example of Montaigne, who simply withdrew from the world, observed it kind of cynically, but would not engage. You know, was invited to become, you know, he could well have become a key advisor to the, you know, to the king, as, you know, Thomas Liverpool. He refused to do that. He pulled back from it. So there's one strand of humanism actually can develop into humanism as we understand it today. There's a strand which people would say it goes towards rationalism and ultimately, you know, towards the French Revolution and the ideas of that time. So I do agree with that. It can go in a number of directions.
So can we, Philip, but it's 9 o'clock.
Right, sorry, Joe.
I just thank Philip for laying the foundations. I think two fundamental ideas again. If only people could understand this, this is one of the big problems we have in the church. Things have not always been the way they are now. Things have changed radically and will continue to change forevermore. And yet we get stuck. We get stuck in the spot as if things have always been like this. That's a huge message for us, and that's one of the things that can lead to the Reformation. That things have not always been the way they are now, and that whole searching for meaning and certainty is when people start to think for themselves. That's a huge thing as well, and we'll be looking at the consequences of that over the coming months. The next time we meet, we're looking at Martin Luther. The person speaking who's sitting there is Larissa. I asked Larissa because Larissa began life as a Lutheran. She's German and she has a degree in theology from Glasgow University. So she's a parishioner and she will explain Luther to us. Do you want to say anything at this point, Larissa?
It's a work in progress.
So we'll look forward to that. So anyway, thanks very much to Philip. Something else I wanted to say, but I can't remember what it was. So thanks a lot.